The sound of a chainsaw is usually the sound of progress. It is the roar of industry, the sharp bite of steel against nature, the noise of a day's work ending in a pile of timber. But on a crisp, overcast afternoon in September 2005, in the deep woods of Harmony Creek, Georgia, that sound changed. It shifted from a mechanical roar to a violent, metal-on-metal scream that would haunt a logger for the rest of his days. Jim Holloway wasn't looking for a mystery. He was looking for oak. He was cutting through a massive, stubborn root system of a tree that had stood tall and silent for 20 years. But when his blade kicked back, sparking against something buried deep in the red Georgia clay, he didn't just hit a rock. He hit a secret. He wiped the sweat from his eyes, killed the engine, and knelt in the dirt. He expected a stone, maybe an old piece of farming equipment forgotten by time. Instead, he brushed away the soil to reveal the corner of a wooden box, rotting and soft, and resting on top of it, glinting dull and accusingly in the filtered sunlight, was a silver cross. Inside that box was not treasure. Inside that box lay the answer to a question that had torn a community apart, destroyed a family, and allowed a killer to walk free for 2 decades. In 1985, a beloved black pastor named Elijah Brooks drove into a storm and vanished off the face of the earth. The police said he ran away. The town whispered he was a sinner. His wife claimed he was murdered. They were all wrong, and yet they were all right. He hadn't run away. He was right there, the whole time. This is not just a story about a murder. This is a story about a seed of hatred planted in the earth, watered by corruption, and hidden by the passage of time, until nature itself decided it was time to scream the truth. This is the story of the pastor in the pines. To understand the horror of the discovery, you must first understand the silence of the woods. The forests surrounding Harmony Creek are ancient things. It is a landscape of towering loblolly pines and sprawling live oaks, where the canopy is so thick it swallows the sunlight, and the ground is carpeted in a century of fallen needles that muffle every footstep. It is a place where things go to be forgotten. Jim Holloway was a man who respected these woods, but he didn't fear them. A veteran logger with calloused hands and a back stiffened by years of labor, Jim viewed the forest through the lens of economics. He saw board feet. He saw yield. He saw the mortgage payment on his double-wide trailer. On September 14, 2005, he was working a tract of land that had recently changed hands, a section of old-growth timber that had been left deliberately untouched for decades. The centerpiece of this section was a magnificent, sprawling oak. It was an anomaly, a hardwood giant surrounded by younger pines. Its roots were thick, gnarled fingers that gripped the earth with an almost desperate strength. To a logger, it was a payday. To fell a tree of that magnitude, you don't just cut the trunk, you have to battle the anchor roots. Jim fired up his steel chainsaw. The 2-stroke engine whined to life, a high-pitched hornet buzzing in the cathedral of trees. He began his work on the southern side of the stump, the chain biting into the bark, sending a plume of wet-tinned sawdust spraying over his boots. The wood was dense, the growth rings tight. This tree had been drinking from this soil for a long time. He worked his way around the base, sweat stinging his eyes despite the autumn chill. He reached a section where the roots plunged vertically into a depression in the ground, a strange hollow that had filled with detritus over the years. He revved the saw and plunged the bar downward to sever the taproot. That was when the world tilted. The sound was agonizing. It wasn't the dull thud of hitting a rock. It was the high-frequency shriek of hardened steel tearing into softer metal. The chainsaw bucked violently in Jim's grip, the kickback nearly throwing the bar into his shin. Sparks, bright, blue-white, and unnatural, erupted from the cut, igniting the sawdust for a split second before dying out. Jim released the throttle. The silence that rushed back into the woods was heavier than before. His heart was hammering against his ribs, a primitive alarm bell ringing in his hindbrain. Chainsaws don't spark on wood. He set the saw down, the smell of ozone and gasoline mixing with the damp earth. He grabbed his entrenching tool from his belt and dropped to his knees. The soil here was loose, surprisingly so, mixed with a dark, organic compost that felt wrong against his gloves. He dug. He scraped away the layer of pine needles, then the red clay, then a layer of strange, rotted fabric that disintegrated at his touch. Canvas, maybe? Or tarp. Then he saw the wood. It wasn't a root. It was a plank. Rough-hewn, pine, completely rotted through by moisture and insects. He cleared more dirt, his breath coming in short, shallow gasps. It was a corner. A box. Someone had buried a crate beneath the tree. His mind raced. Harmony Creek had legends, like every southern town. Confederate gold, a moonshiner's cash stash, a time capsule. Jim reached down to pry a loose board away. As he applied pressure, the wood crumbled, collapsing inward into the void beneath. And with the collapse came the smell. It wasn't the smell of decomposition that had passed years ago. It was the smell of a tomb. Stale air, trapped for 20 years, rising up to meet the living world. Jim leaned forward, peering into the gloom of the hole he had made. A shaft of sunlight pierced the canopy, illuminating the interior of the box. He saw the leather first, or what was left of it. A black, bound book, swollen with water damage. The pages fused together into a solid brick. And resting on the book, bleached white against the dark soil, was a curvature of bone. A rib. Then the unmistakable roundness of a skull, turned sideways, staring eternally into the dark. Jim scrambled backward, his boots slipping in the mud, a cry stuck in his throat. He crab-walked away from the stump, his eyes wide, his mind refusing to process the image. He had unearthed a grave, but it was what lay next to the skull that froze his blood. A necklace. A simple, tarnished silver chain with a heavy cross pendant. He knew that cross. Everyone in Harmony Creek over the age of 30 knew that cross. It was the same cross that used to bounce against the chest of the man who baptized half the county. Jim Holloway reached for his radio, his hand trembling so badly he dropped it twice. He wasn't calling his foreman. He was calling the police. The oak tree hadn't just been growing in the dirt. It had been feeding on a crime scene. To understand the gravity of what lay in that box, we have to rewind the clock. We have to strip away the moss and the years and go back to the sweltering, humid summer of 1985. Harmony Creek was a town divided, not by a wall, but by a railroad track and a century of unspoken rules. On one side stood the manicured lawns and the brick facades of the town square. On the other, the unpaved roads and the clapboard houses of the black community. Bridging the gap, or attempting to, was the Bethlehem Star Baptist Church, and at the pulpit stood Reverend Elijah Brooks. Elijah Brooks was a man carved from granite and grace. At 45 years old, he possessed a voice that could rattle the stained glass windows and a laugh that could disarm the angriest skeptic. He was a shepherd in the truest sense. He didn't just preach on Sundays. He lived in the trenches of his community. He organized food drives, he mediated disputes, and most dangerously, he advocated for change. 1985 was a volatile time. The civil rights movement was history in the books, but in the rural pockets of Georgia, the old guard was still holding on with a death grip. Elijah had recently begun a voter registration drive, busing the elderly to the county seat to ensure they were on the rolls. He was pushing for representation on the school board. He was making noise in a town that preferred silence. But Elijah's troubles weren't just external. Inside the walls of the Bethlehem Star, a different kind of rot was spreading. The church was the financial heart of the community. Families tithed faithfully, giving 10% of their meager earnings in the hope of spiritual and community uplift. Elijah trusted his deacons implicitly, specifically Deacon Harold Jones. Harold was a sharp contrast to Elijah. Where Elijah was broad-shouldered and loud, Harold was slight, bespectacled, and quiet. He was the treasurer, the man with the keys to the safe and the ledger. He was a man who craved the respect Elijah commanded effortlessly. Harold walked in the Reverend's shadow, and in that darkness, resentment began to grow like a fungus. In the weeks leading up to August 1985, the atmosphere in the Brooks household changed. Martha Brooks, Elijah's wife of 20 years, noticed a shift. Elijah, usually a man who slept the deep sleep of the righteous, began pacing the floor at night. One evening, sitting on their porch as the cicadas screamed in the trees, Elijah spoke to Martha in a voice she barely recognized. "Something isn't right, Martha," he said, clutching his Bible, the same leather-bound Bible Jim Holloway would find 20 years later. "The numbers don't add up. The building fund, the outreach cash, it's bleeding. The church is bleeding. Have you spoken to Harold?" Martha asked, pouring him iced tea. Elijah looked out toward the tree line, his face grim. "I did. He told me I was tired. He told me to focus on the saving of souls and leave the counting of coins to him. But I saw his eyes, Martha. A man looks at you a certain way when he's holding a lie." Elijah wasn't just a preacher. He was a man of principle. He began his own investigation. He started arriving at the church office early, before Harold could hide the ledger. He found receipts that led nowhere. He found withdrawals made in cash that never materialized into repairs or supplies. He discovered that the embezzlement wasn't just petty theft. It was systematic. And worse, as he dug deeper, he found that the money wasn't just going into Harold's pocket. It was flowing out of the church and into the campaign coffers of a local politician, a white councilman named Thomas Reed, a man who publicly opposed Elijah's voter drives while privately taking the church's stolen money to fund his re-election. It was a triangle of corruption: the deacon who wanted money, the politician who wanted power, and the sheriff who protected them both. Sheriff Big Jim Donnelly was the law in Harmony Creek, a man with a stomach that strained his buttons and a worldview that hadn't updated since 1950. Donnelly viewed Elijah Brooks not as a community leader, but as an agitator. Elijah knew that going to the police was useless. Donnelly and Reed were hunting buddies. They fished the same creeks. They drank the same bourbon. So, Elijah made a decision. He was going to bypass the local law. He was compiling a dossier, a collection of copied bank statements and falsified ledger pages. He told Martha he was going to take it to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, in Atlanta. "I'm going on Tuesday," he told her on a Sunday night. "I'm going to cleanse the temple." He never made it to Tuesday. August 24th, 1985. The heat in Georgia was a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of humidity that made the air shimmer off the asphalt. The weather forecast called for a massive line of thunderstorms to break the heat wave that night. Elijah had stayed late at the church. It was a Wednesday prayer service, sparsely attended. After the last parishioner had shaken his hand and driven off, Elijah stayed behind. He told Martha he needed to grab the evidence file he had locked in his desk, just to be safe. He wanted to bring it home. Martha kissed him at the door of the parsonage. "Don't be long, Eli. The sky is turning green. It's going to be a bad one. I'll be back before the first drop falls," he promised. He climbed into his faded blue Ford F-150, the truck that was as much a part of him as his collar. Martha watched the taillights fade down the dirt road. She went inside, turned on the radio, and waited. The storm hit at 9 p.m. It was violent, a fury of wind that bowed the pecan trees and rain that lashed the windows like gravel. Thunder shook the foundation of the house. Martha paced the living room. 9:30, 10 o'clock, 10:30. She called the church office. The phone rang and rang, echoing in the empty building miles away. By midnight, the storm had passed, leaving behind a dripping, eerie silence. Panic, cold and sharp, set in. Martha called Deacon Harold. "Harold, is Eli there? Did he get stuck?" Harold's voice was groggy, or pretending to be. "No, Martha. He left right after service. Said he was heading straight to you. Maybe he pulled over to wait out the rain." Martha put on her raincoat and drove the route. She drove it twice. The road was empty. The church was dark. The parking lot was empty. At 2 a.m., she drove to the sheriff's station. The night deputy, a young man who looked bored, barely looked up from his magazine. "Sheriff's asleep, Mrs. Brooks. It's probably nothing. Man probably has a girlfriend, or maybe he just needed a drive. You go home. We'll look in the morning." Martha stood her ground. "My husband does not have a girlfriend. He is missing. Something has happened." The search began the next morning, but it was a search designed to fail. Sheriff Donnelly took charge. His deputies found Elijah's truck 3 hours later. It wasn't on the road home. It was parked awkwardly on an old logging trail near the dense forest line, miles in the opposite direction. The driver's door was wide open. The keys were in the ignition. The battery was dead, indicating the headlights had been left on until they drained. On the passenger seat sat Elijah's Bible, or rather, a Bible. But the dossier, the file of evidence Elijah had gone to retrieve, was nowhere to be found. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle in the cab. The ground outside was a soup of mud from the storm, washing away any tire tracks or footprints that might have told the story. Sheriff Donnelly stood by the truck, chewing on a toothpick, looking at the vast expanse of the woods. "Looks like a walk-off," he declared to the gathering crowd. Pressure got to him. Maybe he took some of that money he was accused of stealing and hitched a ride to Florida. The narrative was being written in real time. The victim was being painted as the villain. But the community knew. The black residents of Harmony Creek gathered at the tree line, staring into the deep shadows of the pines. They didn't see a man who ran away. They saw a truck that had been planted. They saw a scene that had been staged. They organized their own search parties. Men with hound dogs, women with walking sticks. They combed the woods for weeks. They shouted Elijah's name until their voices were hoarse. They walked right past a fresh mound of earth, sitting beneath a young oak sapling, where the ground had been disturbed. But the forest floor is messy after a storm. Leaves and debris cover everything. They walked over his grave, prayed for his return, and never looked down. The days turned into weeks, the weeks into months. The investigation was a farce. Sheriff Donnelly refused to fingerprint the truck. He refused to interview Deacon Harold or Councilman Reed, despite Martha's insistence that Elijah was meeting them. The missing money narrative took hold. Without Elijah there to defend himself, Deacon Harold controlled the story. He showed the congregation the cooked books. "See," he would say, feigning tears, "our brother was troubled. He took the building fund. That's why he ran." It was a masterclass in gaslighting. Martha was isolated. She received anonymous letters in the mail, cut-out magazine, letters pasted on paper. "Stop looking. He's gone. You're next." Her house was broken into. Nothing was stolen, but the family photos were smashed. It was psychological torture designed to drive her out. And eventually, it worked. Broken-hearted and terrified, Martha moved to Chicago to stay with her sister. She left Harmony Creek, but she never stopped writing letters to the GBI, to the governor, to anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, in Harmony Creek, life went on. Deacon Harold became the head of the church board. He bought a new car. He wore nicer suits. Councilman Reed was reelected, his campaign flush with cash from anonymous donors. Sheriff Donnelly retired comfortably 5 years later and died of a heart attack in 1995, taking his secrets to the grave. The church, however, withered. Without the fire of Elijah's preaching, the pews emptied. The building fell into disrepair. It was as if the building itself was mourning. And in the woods, the oak tree grew. It fed on the nutrients in the soil. Its roots expanded, wrapping around the wooden box, crushing it, embracing it. The tree became a marker, a silent sentinel standing guard over the crime. For 20 years, hunters walked by it. Lovers carved initials into trees nearby. The seasons turned, 20 winters, 20 springs. The canvas wrapped around the body rotted away. The wood of the box softened. The evidence waited. Nature is the one witness you cannot bribe. You can intimidate a wife, you can pay off a deputy, but you cannot stop a tree root from growing. We return to the clearing. September 2005. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation, GBI, descended on the logging site like a swarm of angry hornets. This was no longer a local matter. The finding of human remains in a box elevated this instantly to a state crime. The scene was cordoned off with yellow tape. Forensic anthropologists were brought in to sift the soil. Jim Holloway, the logger, sat on the tailgate of his truck, drinking coffee with a shaking hand, watching them work. The excavation was slow and meticulous. They didn't just pull the bones out. They had to separate them from the root system that had grown through the ribcage. It was a gruesome fusion of biology and botany. As they sifted the dirt, the evidence began to mount. First, the Bible. It was bagged and sent to the lab. Second, the remnants of clothing. Synthetic fibers from a polyester suit, the kind a preacher would wear on a Wednesday night. And then, the smoking gun, or rather, the bullet. Lodged in the dirt, directly beneath where the spine had rested, was a deformed lead slug, a .38 caliber bullet. It had passed through the body and come to rest in the bottom of the box. The remains were sent to the medical examiner in Atlanta. Dental records were requested from Martha Brooks in Chicago. The match was confirmed within 48 hours. The skeleton was Reverend Elijah Brooks. The cause of death was a single gunshot wound to the chest, fired at close range. This was an execution. The news hit Harmony Creek like a thunderclap. The runaway pastor was a lie. He had been murdered and buried less than 3 miles from his pulpit. The vindication for the black community was bittersweet. They were right, but their hero was gone. For the GBI Cold Case Unit, led by Special Agent Mark Miller, the clock was ticking. The murder was 20 years old. The sheriff was dead. But murder has no statute of limitations. Miller started with a bullet. Ballistics technology had advanced light years since 1985. While they couldn't match the bullet to a gun they didn't have, they could identify the specific type of ammunition. It was a hollow point .38 special, a round commonly issued to law enforcement in the 1980s. This pointed the finger at Sheriff Donnelly. But Donnelly was dead. You can't handcuff a corpse. Agent Miller needed a living suspect. He turned his eyes to the survivor of that unholy trinity, Deacon Harold Jones. Harold was now 72 years old. He was frail, living in a nursing home on the outskirts of town. His mind was slipping, but his conscience was seemingly intact, or at least his fear was. Agent Miller brought Harold in for an interview. He didn't arrest him yet. He simply sat him down in a sterile room, placed a photo of the unearthed box on the table, and waited. "We found him, Harold," Miller said softly. "We found Elijah, and we found the Bible." Harold stared at the photo. His hands, spotted with age, began to tremble. "And here's the thing about that Bible, Harold," Miller lied. "A tactical bluff. We found a fingerprint preserved on the inside cover. Oils from the skin, trapped between the pages where the water didn't reach. We're running it now." It was a gamble. Fingerprints rarely survive 20 years in a wet grave. But Harold didn't know that. Harold was living in 1985, where fingerprints were magic. Harold looked up, his eyes watery and terrified. "It wasn't supposed to happen," he whispered. The room went silent. The air conditioners hummed. "What wasn't supposed to happen, Harold?" "The gun," Harold wheezed. "It just went off." The confession that followed was a disjointed, horrific recount of the night of August 24th, 1985. According to Harold, the plan had been hatched by Sheriff Donnelly and Councilman Reed. They knew Elijah was going to the GBI with the ledger. They had to stop him. They lured him to the woods under a false pretense. Harold had called Elijah that night, begging him to meet them at the logging trail for a reconciliation. He told Elijah that Reed was willing to return the money if Elijah handed over the files. Elijah, ever the optimist, ever the shepherd believing a wolf could change, agreed to meet them. When Elijah arrived in his truck, he didn't find a reconciliation. He found Sheriff Donnelly holding a revolver and Thomas Reed holding a shovel. "Give us the file, preacher," Donnelly had growled. Elijah stood tall in the rain. "I don't have it," he said. "And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to thieves." Donnelly pistol-whipped him. Elijah fell to the mud. Harold watched from the shadows, paralyzed by fear and greed. "Search the truck," Donnelly barked. Harold and Reed tore the truck apart. They found nothing. The file wasn't there. Elijah had hidden it somewhere safe before coming, a location he took to his grave. Enraged and panicked, realizing that Elijah was still going to report them, the situation spiraled. Donnelly pointed the gun at Elijah's chest. "You're going to keep your mouth shut, boy." Elijah looked at Harold. "Harold," he said, his voice calm amidst the storm, "what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and lose his soul?" That scripture broke something in Harold, but it didn't make him save Elijah. It made him panic. He lunged forward, grabbing Donnelly's arm, shouting, Don't shoot him here. The noise. In the scuffle, the wet gun slipped. The hammer dropped. Bang. The shot echoed through the trees. Elijah Brooks collapsed, a bloom of red spreading on his white shirt. He died within seconds, the rain washing the blood into the soil. The three men stood over the body. The sheriff, the politician, and the deacon. "We can't leave him here," Reed said. "The logging crews come through here next month. They'll find him." They decided to bury him right there, but deep. They found an old wooden crate used for hauling equipment in the back of Reed's truck. They jammed the body inside. Harold, in a bizarre act of guilt-ridden reverence, placed Elijah's Bible and his cross necklace in the box with him. They dug for hours. They buried the box deep, beneath the roots of a young oak sapling, counting on the tree to grow over the site and hide the disturbance. "That tree will keep him down," Donnelly had said. They drove Elijah's truck to the other side of the woods to stage the abandonment. They went home, washed the mud from their clothes, and went to sleep. For 20 years, Harold Jones walked into the Bethlehem Star Church, sat in the front row, and prayed to the same God Elijah had served, all while knowing his friend was rotting in a box he helped nail shut. Following the confession, the wheels of justice turned with a grinding finality. Councilman Thomas Reed was long dead, killed in a car accident in 1990. Sheriff Donnelly was dead. Harold Jones was the only one left to answer for the crime. He was arrested and charged with felony murder. Due to his advanced age and failing health, he pleaded guilty in exchange for a life sentence, which, for him, meant dying in prison. But the real climax of this story wasn't in the courtroom. It was in the church. In November 2006, a memorial service was held for Reverend Elijah Brooks. It was the funeral he never had. The Bethlehem Star Church was packed, not just with the black community, but with white residents, state officials, and people who had driven from 3 states away. Martha Brooks, now walking with a cane, was escorted down the aisle. She carried a small plastic bag. Inside was the silver cross, polished and bright again. She walked to the pulpit, the same pulpit Elijah had preached from. She placed the cross on the wood. "They thought they buried him," she said, her voice clear and strong, amplified by the microphone. "They thought they could put the truth in a box and plant a tree on top of it. But they forgot one thing about seeds. If you plant them, they grow." Elijah was a seed, and the truth has finally bloomed. Jim Holloway, the logger who found him, sat in the back row, wiping tears from his eyes with his rough hands. He had come to pay his respects to the man he had unknowingly rescued from the dark. The murder of Elijah Brooks is a terrifying reminder of the fragility of justice. For 20 years, the official story was a lie. For 20 years, the bad guys won. They lived their lives, spent the stolen money, and died in their beds. But the earth remembers. It brings into question every walk you've ever taken in the woods. When you see a depression in the ground, or a tree with roots that seem to twist unnaturally around a hollow spot, do you wonder what lies beneath? Elijah Brooks' story teaches us that while evil may have a head start and corruption may have the power, the truth has time. It has infinite patience. It can wait in the cold, dark earth for decades, waiting for the right storm, the right erosion, or the right chainsaw to set it free. So the next time you hear the sound of a saw in the distance, or the crack of a falling tree, remember the pastor in the pines. Remember that nothing stays buried forever. If you were Jim Holloway, alone in those woods, seeing that cross glinting in the dirt, would you have made that call? Or would you have covered it back up and walked away, afraid of the ghosts who might wake up? Let me know in the comments below. And as always, stay safe, stay curious, and keep the lights on.